So I'm just going to talk you through some basic embroidery stitches and some more fancy ones, just to up your kind of sewing repertoire. There are hundreds, thousands of stitches that you can do and you can learn. I think these are great, some great basics to get you started on your sewing and embroidery journey. Just show you some embroidery inspiration, the kind of things that I do with it. So I do a lot of upcycling. So you can see I've used quite simple stitches to make these things up. Here, little tassel, something on a little shirt pocket here and here. And I think what's great about embroidery is that everybody has their own style of doing it. Mine's a little bit wonky, a little bit messy, and that's how I like it. Some people really like really tiny, neat stitches. It's totally up to you how you want to do it. For your embroidery, you will need the fabric that you're going to be stitching on, a hoop, a needle, and some threads. So, the first thing we want to talk about is transferring your design onto your fabric. So you might want to just stitch freestyle. It's fine, especially when you're practicing your stitches. You could use a pencil. If you've got a dark fabric, you might want to get a light coloured pencil, or a bit of chalk or a bit of soap is also good. And you can draw on your design. I don't normally draw things before I sew. I'm a bit of a freestyle stitcher, but I'm going to draw a little something like that. So you could also do this on the back if you were worried about it staying there for after you finish sewing. Normally it would just brush off. So the next thing you should do is get your fabric in your hoop. So the hoop comes with a bigger one with a screw on the top and a smaller one. Put the smaller one underneath. Think about which bit of your design you're going to do first. So don't feel constricted to the circle, because you can put it in there, move your fabric over, put it in over here. I'm just going to do mine in the middle, like that. Squeeze it on, and then you tighten this screw as tight as it will go. And then the next important bit is just to pull it round like this. So tighten it again, and you're pulling. You can see my fingers are just kind of pulling on it, so it's tight like a drum. And then we're ready to stitch. The reason why we put it in a hoop is so your fabric stays taut and your stitches don't get all scrunched up as you're going. If you're doing some stitching on some like clothes, if you're upcycling them, you might not be able to get it in a hoop around certain places, and if you've got stiff fabric, it's okay. So it's not the end of the world if you don't have a hoop, but it does keep the tension really nice for when you're trying to stitch. If you want to stitch near the edge of something, and you can't get it in your hoop, say I wanted to fill in this gap here, what you could do is get another bit of fabric. You can kind of pin or even hand stitch the fabric. I'm just going to use that for now, like this. Then put your hoop on. Okay, so then you want to prepare your threads. So threads will often come on with a little bit of paper around them. And what you can do, if you find the end of your thread and then you pull from the middle, and I always stitch. I never make the thread any longer than my arm because I can't pull any longer than my arm is long, so I cut it off here. So if you pull it out of the little case like this, your threads will be a lot neater, unlike my little bird's nest over here, but we won't talk about that. Try and keep the threads nice and neat and in their cases. So, one thing you can do, so you could stitch with your thread thick like this, but you could also split it. So often embroidery threads are what we call 6-ply, so they've got 6 little strands. So what you can do is get your fingers in there and pull the strands apart. So I'm doing some strands of 3 here. And that just gives you a bit of a thinner line. Oh, tangled. Don't worry if it gets tangled. The more you just kind of untangle and you can keep pulling. And eventually you'll get these threads apart. So the first thing you need to do is thread your needle. So my top tip for threading a needle is to hold the thread between your fingers like this, so you've got a teeny tiny bit sticking over, and then you take the needle down onto the thread while you're holding it. And that's my foolproof way. Then I tie a little knot in the end. So go around my finger, pull it off, and then the tail goes through the loop. Do that a couple of times. I know some people don't knot their threads at the start of when they're doing hand stitching, but I tend to. You can find your own way as well. And then if you're hand stitching, start from the back, bring your needle up, and the trick with hand sewing, because if you've not doubled over your thread, your needle might come unthreaded. So when it comes through, you get these other 2 fingers here to hold onto the thread like a little clamp, and then you pull it out, and you're leaving the thread on the needle, so it kind of, your fingers act as a little clamp on the thread. I'll show you again in a second. So the first stitch I'm going to teach you is a running stitch. If you've done any sewing before, this is probably the stitch that you've used. It's the most basic hand sewing stitch, and it is the one that goes in, out, in, out. You don't have to do kind of all of these at once when you're just starting out, but just make it a bit quicker. So you can, I guess traditionally the spaces should be the same size as the stitches, but you know, you can also go do your own thing with it as well. But that is a basic running stitch, and can you see as it comes up, I hold that, clamp it and pull. When you finish stitching, so I'm going to stop here, turn it over, and I'm going to do a little teeny tiny stitch in the back. Just, you can't see it from the front really, it's just going to be next to where my stitch was. So I've got this little stitch, and then my needle is going to go through this stitch. Before you pull it tight, you take your needle through this loop. Go like this. Before you pull it tight, needle through the loop. Do that twice, and that does a little knot. And then you cut your thread, and that is a basic running stitch. The next stitch I'm going to show you is something called a back stitch. So back stitches are really good for filling in full lines. Obviously these have got dots in them, dashes in them. So I'm going to take my needle from the back, and what you do with a back stitch is you do a little You take it in as if you do with a running stitch, you come back out, but then you come back and you fill in this gap. So this is really good for if you're doing outlines of something, or even writing. So you want to do little writing. And again, the stitch length that you choose, stitch length you can choose. It's totally up to you. You might be a really dainty stitcher and do tiny stitches. Doesn't have a rule. Maybe there was a rule at one point, but we're here to break the rules, aren't we? We can stitch however we want. So this is our little back stitch. And can you see I've used the 6-ply thread for this, so you can see the slight difference. This is thicker and this is a bit thinner. So that is your back stitch. So related to a back stitch, you also have the stem stitch, which is really nice for things like stems, as the name would suggest. So what you do with a stem stitch, it comes up halfway through the last one, and forms like this. A little cross stitch. So if you've done kind of tapestry or had little cross stitch kits, you'll be familiar with this one. You go up and down in a diagonal, then you come over to one of the other corners and then go down. So you kind of imagine that you're filling in a little grid. Do the next one. You could do them next to each other, you can do them as single stitches. There's lots of options with a cross stitch. The next one I want to show you is a French knot. So I do this with 2 hands, get my needle, and you have your needle pointing one way. I'm left-handed, so you might be doing it that way, but it's the same process. Then you get your thread, wrap it around your needle with the other hand, then you take your needle back through the same spot and you get this cute little knot. I'll do it again. So we go around the needle like this, in through the same spot you started in, and you get a sweet little French knot. So the next stitch I'm going to show you is a chain stitch. So you bring your needle up, as we have done with all the others, and then you put your needle back down in basically where it just came back up, where you just came from. Then you bring your needle up, and can you see sometimes I need to angle my needle with my finger at the back, so my finger's there pushing on it at the back to get my needle back up. And then with a chain stitch, this is the important bit, you've got to make sure that your thread is underneath the needle like that, and then you pull and you get this little loop of a chain. So then you go back again, same place that you just went in. Make sure that your needle is, your thread is under your needle, come up. So you can do this in a line. Makes a really nice decorative shape. You can also do it in a circle, and this is called a lazy daisy. So you go in, same point, come up, anchor the chain at the top, so you come back in, do the next petal, can look really cute with a little French knot in the inside, and your petals can be longer as well. They don't have to be teeny tiny. You could do a longer stitch in the middle. As you're stitching, if your fabric starts to come loose again, you might just want to re-tighten it and pull it back round. So the next one is something called a satin stitch. Now this is really good for filling in shapes, and as I said, I've ignored my drawing that I did earlier, but I'm going to do another little drawing. So I'm going to do a little square like this that I'm going to fill in with satin stitches. So satin stitch, you come up at the start of your shape, you go down, and then you come back up real close to the last stitch, like that. There we go. My shape's a little uneven, but so you get a nice smooth shape. They need to be really close together, and actually it looks very similar on the back as it does on the front. I often think it's called a satin stitch because it's so smooth. It's really great for filling in shapes. So I've changed to green thread because I'm going to do a couple of stitches that I think look quite a lot like leaves. First, it's called a raised herringbone stitch, and I'm just gonna, I don't normally draw it in, but I'm just going to draw in a little leafy shape so you can see what it's like filling it up. So you do a little stitch at the bottom of the leaf like this, and then you take your needle up to the top of the point, and then you go in your stitch. If you're right-handed, you might go the other way, doesn't really matter. You're not going through the fabric, you're going through the bottom stitch. Pull it tight, like this, and then every time you're going in and out and through that stitch. So can you see I've moved down just a fraction, down the leaf, and I'm going in and then out on that side. Here we go. And then you go through, always go in the same direction, through the bottom of the leaf. Lovely. Right, so we keep going, we're making our way down the leaf. Every time you just slightly move down. So I think that makes a really nice petal or a leaf shape. And then at the end you can kind of end it. So the second kind of leaf that we're going to do is something called a fishbone stitch, and this one starts at the top. Like this. And then what you do is make your way down the shape, but always overlapping the last one that you did. So I'm just going to stitch on this side, overlap here, stitch on this side, overlap here, stitch on this side. Now I'm just going to show you a little circular stitch. Could be a rose, could be anything you want it to be. So what you need to do first of all is make yourself a 5-sided star. Doesn't actually matter how well you want the spaces between them quite evenly spaced, but it's not the end of the world if they're not exact, because this star is just our base. So the star has got this kind of same starting point in the centre. Once you've got that, you come up through the centre with your needle, and then we're not going through the fabric again, we're actually just going to weave in and out of these strands that you've created. So under that one, over this one, over that one, under this one, and you keep going round, alternating what you did last. The reason why we have 5 points is so that every time you go over and under, you're doing the opposite of what happened on that before. Because if you did it the same, you wouldn't get this lovely rose effect. You'd kind of get you'd still see the lines. So keep going. And if you accidentally did like one of your lines longer than the others, what I tend to do is just stop. If I'm happy, I can stop, and I'll cover that extra little bit with a leaf or something like that. So it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to end with something a little bit fun and different. I'm going to make a little tassel flower. So I'm going to wrap some thread around my finger. You could also wrap it round a little bit of cardboard, doesn't have to be your finger. Depends how bushy you want your tassel to be. I'm going to stop there, cut that off. So I'm going to take a little extra bit of thread, do a nice tight knot with them. There we go. Okay, so then you cut up the middle there, and we have a cute little tassel. You can cut it even. So then you can attach it to your fabric. So what I try to do, as it looks like a flower, kind of catch the bottom bit, you can do a couple of stitches in the bottom to keep that in place. And then can kind of cover this bit, turning it into a little stem. Or if you don't want a stem, you could just cut that bit a bit. Once you've secured it down, you could cut it a bit shorter. and you can layer them up with different colours, but that's also just a little bit of fun you can have. So these are just a selection of stitches you can do. There are hundreds of stitches that you might find, and also keep practicing. The more you practice, the more neat your stitches will get, and the more you'll kind of learn as you go along.